So I didn't intend to do this right now. I just kind of got curious in between things and just doing another layer of looking into the references pertaining to the subject of Amalek. And it is kind of interesting because, so there's this passage and it introduces some of the sons of Esau in Genesis 36:12. Introduces Amalek as one of the sons. And it's interesting how when people make reference to Amalek, they seem to assume that it's like all of Edom under Esau instead of just Amalek. And so in this context, when you're looking at it, so like what happens in general, this is like you still got to check notes. I'm just doing a general talking through. This is like live notes. It almost seems like when you look at what's happening is because at that time the Israelites were journeying through the wilderness after the Exodus and they were going toward Canaan. And, well, it was a long route through there. They would still spend time in the wilderness and develop some of the certain teachings of Moses and whatnot. But anyway, they eventually then get attacked by Amalek. And what you find is that it doesn't say like they were... Anyway, there's a lot. I had talked about that. And then later, when they're journeying even farther, it talks about them entering into this certain region that's also seeming to be an association of Esau and whatnot, and some of the kings, some of the sons and the descendants. And they want to get a word about what's going on, and then that's when they get that word. What's also interesting is that the story starts portraying this difference of like entanglements with kings as leaders, and then those like within their administration or those of their descendants and others just like on the peripheral of their administration or leadership. And one of the main things that we start finding is that God seems to be trying to transform the way that people manage their dominions. Not so much just blotting out entire groups of people, but transforming the way that their systems function and how it becomes entangled amongst each other. And at this point in history, we also know that Esau is like the relative of, or like the brother of Jacob. And we also find that there wasn't pure historical accounts with either of them. They were both represented as entangled in the same entanglements of systems and kingdoms and whatnot. The difference was that there was a spiritual calling through some groups to not function in that power and to start internally transforming it through the Spirit. And so it's that distinction among groups that are of shared descendants themselves, just to like basically they're involved in this transformative work that has this like certain seed of spiritual transformation alongside all these entanglements. Basically, so the point isn't to really blot out entire groups. It's just entirely transformative. And so what's interesting here is that Amalek is actually just one of the like descendants amongst a variety of other descendants and kings and leaders and whatnot. And so what it seems to be drawing them into is that as they make this pact from the world kingdom domain of cursing back and forth, or things along those lines, or being confused about that which is the standard of blessing, because they are functioning, many of them on their own, whether on the side of Israel or non-Israel, are functioning in their sense of survival and self-preservation. And then that intensifies and solidifies their standard unto their kingdoms. And so we're just kind of getting this long process of what is transformative to that. And it isn't as easy as saying they're holistically evil and we're good, or they're holistically good and we're, It's just, it's entangled in a lot of things. Anyway, though, so when you look back at the story, so there's the reference of, it portrays in Genesis that they're from the lineage and descendants of the Edomites, like Amalek. And then it portrays this skirmish that they get into when they're coming out, when they're at a stage. It kind of introduces it almost like they make themselves possibly susceptible to it, or they're both on the sides of. It doesn't really say. It's just there's this skirmish that happens. It turns into this like kind of battle. But what's interesting about this story is that the distinction of the battle isn't really power of their own, because we're starting to see that's what the symbolism in the story is starting to try to slowly turn around. The distinction in the battle is that Moses takes the staff that he was given when he was being convinced to take on this like spiritual journey and go into Egypt, and then he has this certain staff that he uses that helps part the water and da 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 da. So it becomes this indicator of this spiritual like a distinction of this journey. And so in this little battle skirmish, he is to raise up that staff. His arms become tired and weary, and so when he lowers his staff, they start to lose. When he raises his staff, they start to win. And so the only indicator there isn't really like who is good or who is evil. The only indicator in that battle is because even at this point, Israel just wants to abandon the whole mission altogether, and they want to go back to Egypt, and they don't even want to be a part of this whole distinction that is this calling of Moses. So at that point, they are at a place where it says right before that, they even want to kill Moses. They want to stone him and kill him so that they can just go back to Egypt and abandon this whole mission. And then they get into this battle. And as they're in this battle, which in a sense could like, here's application, it might not be the correct, but it could be what I'm saying is like, they want to abandon this mission under the assumption that they can just go back to business as usual and the entanglements of the world won't bother them. And so in some ways, it's as though possibly like God just surrenders them to that request and sees how everyone is already susceptible to entanglements, whether here in the wilderness or whether back in Egypt. Like there's entanglements everywhere. The only way is to transform it and go through it. So eventually he surrenders them to their request to just be back in the midst of entanglements. So then the next chapter, they get into this skirmish. And so it functions as a reminder to them that the only way through all of these continual gridlocked entanglements is a spiritual transformation. And so then that's what they see with this story, at least, is that it's not that they're good and they're evil, or they're evil or they're good. It's not even said about that. It's that they either decide to be in a spiritual transformative distinction or they don't, and then they function through kingdom powers that have become entangled and vulnerable on all fronts. From that stage then, with this first initial battle of Amalek, they then it kind of situates them back and gives them enough to like keep going on the journey, this like mysterious, unique spiritual calling of transformative approach, even though reluctantly. Then this is where they write down this documenting in the scroll, remember Amalek for what he has done and he'll be blotted out, da 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 da, like a blood account or something to that effect. And then so just in general, the next thing that happens is, like, to my knowledge, I mean, there's a lot more. These studies can go deep because like every section has references back to other things. But in general, then the next phase is when they're approaching farther. And this is what I talked about before. And one of the kings then, which also appears to be a part of this certain like mixed lineage, then this is where he calls the seer in to come. He seems to interpret it as a threat. He interprets them as a threat. And then you kind of wonder, why did he just automatically interpret them as a threat? And it seems as though he interprets them as a threat, possibly because he knows that they had previously been provoked into a battle. And so he wants to get ahead of it and kind of see where they're at in it and get a word from the seer and whatnot. And that was just very common in those days. Like groups would do that before they'd go out to battle and whatnot. But they had to make sure, just like in a lot of the old cultures and old ways, you have to make sure that you're in a good place so that when you're seeking for something, you're drawing to yourself the right type of form of wisdom or direction. Anyway, I talked about that before. So this is what he does. And then it just kind of talks about how Israel then also gets absorbed into this because it also gives a word against like Amalek and da-da-da-da-da and whatnot. So you see, like, even in the old stories, the way that people would discern the times is that they would tend to seem to have an association with drawing out the blood accounts, like tapping into or understanding the historical conflicts and then gauging that as to like the direction of where negotiations would go. And anyway, so then that's what leads into the whole Saul thing and whatnot. What I find interesting, though, is when you look back and you see that Amalek was just one of the sons of various ones that did this attack, it's interesting that this comes up at the time of Saul. And it seems more of like a reference of possibly the same thing that happened to Saul. And so what we're learning is we're discerning the conflicts that instigate kingdoms to go to war and the thing they didn't do and the things that happened. And so what we find is like a similar thing happened with Saul. Once they became in the domain of the kings and seeing things that way, his son seems to be portrayed in this passage as playing the role of Amalek. And the thing that one of the other Edomite kings had worried about is the same things that King Saul worried about. And so he's kind of portraying, look, now you're in the seat of kings and now you should understand it from their perspective. You're doing the things that they get caught up doing as well as being kings. And so when it says this, it's an interesting association because Jonathan does what seemingly Amalek did. Goes and instigate a fight when they didn't need to do that, potentially, or, that's the assumption. Makes the group, like Saul even says about when Jonathan did this, a stench in, like, we've become a stench to them. Basically, like, you have forced our hand improperly and you have made us vulnerable to them unnecessarily. You provoked this. And what they find is that, so that's what seemingly Amalek possibly did. That's the result as the king that Saul had. That's what Amalek did. That's the result of that's the result that the previous king had. And these types of things lead to increased battle and war, and they justify it. What you also find in the story, so what's also interesting, the way this story in the scriptures read, is that there's a certain enemy. And then when they get to be a version of the enemy, it shows what's happening internally. And that's what you also get with like King Solomon's kingdom, is they become a kingdom similar to the others. But then we get to kind of see, because it's their story being told, what's happening internally that's causing kingdoms to rise and fall like that. And so we get this story of like the Edomites, which is like the other. And then you get the story of it happening internally with Saul and his son, which is like what showing us what happened and how it intensifies. And we also see that Saul didn't, there was a room. It's not as though, okay, you made this mistake and Jonathan provoked them and now it's perpetual war, because it did lead to perpetual war because they never corrected that. And they started to, because it was also an indicator of the people and what they were desiring for. And so it was hard for Saul to get ahead of that. And so you see this just perpetuate and perpetuate and perpetuate, even to the point where these days we still have on the world stage battles being provoked and people saying that they're Amalek or they're Amalek, when they are probably acting as the character Amalek in the framework of what it was talking about, like inappropriate provocations of war that force the hand of other people to be in continuous provocations of war, and you're doing a similar thing that the other side is doing. I mean, it kind of does ring true to like what Jesus was saying, is like, look at what you're doing and how it's very similar to what they're doing and how you're justifying it, like the blindness in your own selves and what you're doing. And so that you can have a clearer vision of how to like transform these situations. You also find, though, at that time when it does call out Saul about the Amalek situation, it does actually seem like it's a claim of saying you're caught up in trying to like do the same thing. And you guys, at this point, when it overcomes you like that, you have to be, at some level you're released to yourselves to like, because they get blotted out in a sense, right? Like he and his son. I think too, like, people do think this just means like just the whole lineage of like Esau and whatnot, but it's just the one son. And then that's what happens to, Jonathan and Saul. But then part of the remnant goes forward, which is like through David. And so it just doesn't seem to track that it's, for all this group of people or all that group of people, as much as like some people responsible for these things then get surrendered to their own way and they become an end of themselves, which that's not even ultimately when you pan out like the intention of God in the story. He's trying to transform that, but he can't get them to enter into the transformative stage of things because they persist in going their own way unto their end because they can't get out of that standard. So that's kind of what you see in the story. So you also see like the standard of that dominion that they take on themselves is a standard that is like set towards themselves as well as they persist in it. So it's kind of one of those things like a standard of destruction could lead to like destruction, but also possibly your own destruction as well. And so it's just another one of those examples of still the need to transform, getting ahead of some of these things. You could look back and you could think, what could have been done differently. But I mean, that's what through like the Exodus and whatnot, they're trying to set up a system, a transformative system, but it takes time because it's just so entrenched in all these entanglements. Anyway, I'm going to leave it at that for now. I just thought I'm going to revisit that really quick. These are just like notes chiseling away at it. I do find it interesting though that people still use that reference of Amalek to this day as justification to wipe out entire nations and whatnot. And it just seems like important to try to correct what that means and what it seems to suggest about God, and that actually it's an example of the error that God is actually trying to correct. But anyway, I'm going to leave it at that for now.